Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, Jerry. Sorry we lost you there. We actually, in hindsight, having two speakers per talk is great in this kind of scenario. We had a backup there. That wasn't in the plan. That just worked out well. But we'll do some questions. We'll catch up on those questions in the networking session. And I will move on to Ivo Dinov, who is from the School of Nursing. Ivo is also the Associate Director in Midas for Education and Training. And Ivo is going to talk about computational neuroscience and space-time. Ivo?
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Does the video project and the screen sharing work okay, Chris?
Just fine.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for joining. The Midas seminar, the Midas Symposium annually attracts so many great talks, so it was great to hear some of the previous speakers. So today I'll present the work that a colleague of mine, Milan Velev at Burgas Technical University, and I are doing on space-time analytics. By the way, just like everything else with soccer, the slides are available online. You can just do a Google search on soccer news, and under today's date, you should find the slide deck. So let's go ahead and press on. Very briefly, I'm going to introduce what big data analytic challenges are. And in the second segment, I'll present what complex time is. I'll showcase some of the interesting mathematical foundations and mention just one. I won't have much time, but there's a lot of open problems in space-time representation. I'll mention one of these, and then I'll end with an interesting case study. So let's start at the beginning. What are the big data challenges? Now, most of us realize that, it's not just the 4 Vs or the 7 Vs. Data sets that are large in size, data sets that are complex to store, represent, and have heterogeneous information are typically considered big data. They also have very important characteristics in terms of being not congruent, which requires very special handling, harmonization, aggregation, etc. Most of the time they come from multiple sources, as you've seen in the previous presentations as well. Very frequently, they're actually multi-scale. You're looking through a prism at the same object, the same phenomenon, the same process at multiple scales. Very frequently, these big biomedical data sets have a longitudinal time dimension to them, and they're never complete. So, these are the 7 characteristics of big data that we consider by having looked at many dozens of different biomedical and healthcare challenges. And these are important to realize simply because they tell you what kind of tools you need to deal with these kinds of data. So let's talk now about complex time and the foundations of space-time analytics. So to begin with, I want to show you this interesting cartoon that kind of tries to show why is it important to look at complex representation of objects. So I'm going to start with 2 images. One is of the Earth here, and one is of Saturn. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them through the Fourier transform, which is going to generate for me the magnitudes of the Fourier transformation, as well as the phases for both the Earth and right up here in this end for Saturn. And you see, the magnitudes, they kind of look, you squint your eyes a little bit, they look kind of the same. The phases do look a little bit different. So what I'm going to do now at the bottom here is I'm going to do very interesting experiments where I'm going to pretend that I'm trying to reconstruct or recover these images simply by looking at their magnitudes and manipulating the phases. So right up here on the left, on the bottom left, I'm using the Earth magnitudes, this image, along with the Saturn phase to attempt to recover the image of the Earth. And you see, it kind of looks, rather than the Earth, it looks like a, messed up, noisy Saturn image. In the next image to the right of it, I have the Earth's magnitude by themselves without any information for the phases. So in other words, I zero down the phases. This image is essentially trivial. And I invert the Fourier transform, and I get something that looks blobby, perhaps Earth-like or planet-like. Next image to the right of that is the reconstruction of the Saturn image by using the Saturn magnitudes right up here, but then swapping the Earth phases, okay? And now mysteriously, you see, this looks more like an Earth than the Saturn. And in the last image here, again, we're doing what we did over here. We are nullifying the phases and just using the magnitude of Saturn to reconstruct them, one can argue that this has some resemblance. The point I'm trying to get across is that when you have a complex object, the information about the phases that very oftentimes is ignored actually captures quite a bit more than the magnitudes themselves, as you can see from these two examples here. So how do we take this to the next phase? So about 100 years ago, a mathematician, Theodore Kaluza, teamed up with a physicist, Oscar Klein, and these guys developed a generalization, an extension of Einstein's general theory of relativity to 5 dimensions. Now, what Kaluza and Klein realized is that this extra dimension that they had to embed in this theory had to be below the Planck constant, which basically means that it's not traversable. So they realized that they can actually make it to be circular. As long as it's very, very small, it will provide you with this notion of an orientation, which you pretty soon is going to be our phase that we're trying to recover. And then essentially this 5-dimensional space that they modeled consists of Minkowski space-time crossed with an S1 circle. So we are going to capitalize on this idea now, and we are going to represent the notion of the temporal longitudinal dimension. I mean, for those of you that have studied longitudinal data, everybody knows that you do it repeatedly, right? You have the same experiments done under exactly the same condition multiple times, and then you make your inference at the end. Well, why do you do that? Well, the reason why we have replicated censoring of information is precisely because we cannot observe the complex time phases. So we are going to define complex time as a complex number that has essentially two free parameters. One is R, or the magnitude of the complex parameter, which we typically refer to as the longitudinal order of event or time. And the second one is phi, which represents the phase of these events. And the phase is gonna go from minus pi to pi. It's essentially periodic angular displacement. So once you have this now, as this image kind of here illustrates, you're gonna be able to represent this 5-dimensional space-time manifold, where the entire 3-dimensional spatial dimension is compressed into a single line here. And then you have the orthogonal thread, the complex time, where circles of given radius correspond to exactly the same longitudinal order of event, but different phases as you go about in a circle. So having this space-time manifold now, where you have now 5 representation parameters that you can control, you can define what's called complex events or k-events. So these represent point or states in the space-time manifold where every k-event is defined by where it occurs in space by its spatial coordinates, x, y, and z, longitude, latitude, and altitude, if you wish. What is its longitudinal order, which is this radial displacement outward from the starting point? And what is its time direction, which is defined in terms of a phase or on our hand of the Cartesian time coordinates. So having that definition, you can extend what's called the space-time interval into a space-time interval, obviously extend the Minkowski 4x4 metric tensor into a 5x5 tensor now, and you can, and you can also define space-time calculus of differentiation and integration, just like you do in the standard Minkowski space-time. And to derive these inverse operation, integration versus differentiation, you're going to use Wirtinger derivatives and path integrals. In addition, you can define motions in space-time, you can define Lorentz transformations, and so various very interesting PDEs, which are actually called ultra-hyperbolic in the situation where the time dimension exceeds 1. So we have done a number of generalizations of the obvious things that we are familiar with from Physics 101, the law of addition of velocities, energy momentum conservation, and all kinds of other things. And here on the right-hand side, I just show you one interesting example. We can actually solve these ultra-hyperbolic partial differential equations, like the wave equation that you are seeing here, projected, of course, you have essentially a 5-dimensional object. We're projecting it in a 3-dimensional scene and displaying it as a 2-dimensional animated image, where one of the animation directions is obviously time, and the other one that's up and down effectively is the phase, and then you have the space is just the horizontal X and Y plane. So we can do these very interesting things. Now, the question is, what does this have to do with data science and with computational neuroscience? Well, the basic idea is that just like you can sample, everybody should be familiar with this notion of sampling from any distribution. So this is an app that we did a number of years ago, where you can draw a distribution of interest, and you can specify how many random observations you want from this distribution. You can sample from this distribution and obtain, obviously, derived sample statistics, right? Means, quartiles, medians, dispersions, and so forth. We can do a very similar thing here, because the time phase we cannot directly measure, but we can indirectly sample, and that's precisely why. So we have here 3 distributions on the right-hand side that kind of show you the green, the black, and the red distributions. And the little dots that are around the circle kind of indicate this notion of randomly sampling from this phase space. These random samples correspond to exactly repeated IID experiments from some kind of a study design. So, and this is what happens in practice. You essentially randomly sample, as you can see here, from that distribution, both the times, which is the magnitude of these radial projections, and then their directions in the 3 distributions are the corresponding phases. So there's a whole bunch of interesting math problems that come out. Just mention one of these very briefly, the notion of ergodicity, right? So if you have functions that can be averaged across space or across time, are you guaranteeing that these f hats, which you obtain by, in this specific case, we are averaging across the time span, and in the f bar, you're going to be averaging at a given fixed time location across space. So the question is, and of course, integration, obviously, everybody understands here, is with respect to a specific measure and so forth. So I am averaging my operator or my function with respect to x, and I get some kind of a value for a given time. Now, I can do the same thing across time for the entire spectrum of time for a given fixed x, and then I can ask my question whether or not a ergodic theorem like this, where that equates the 2 f bar and f tilde actually holds in place. So let's now draw specifically the connection between space-time and data science and neuroscience. The basic idea is to translate established mathematical physics ideas like particles, observable quantities, states of objects, systems, wave functions, transformations, and so forth into the data in neurosciences. And particles, they become objects. These observables, they become features. They're called variables, features. States, they become unique datum points. Particle system becomes a problem, some kind of a data system. And most importantly, wave functions that physicists and mathematicians use in quantum mechanics and mathematical physics, they translate into inference functions. And that's precisely where we are going to be heading out to. So how does the space-time analytics work in practice? Well, once we extend time to complex time, we have these one-to-one mappings between wave functions and inference functions. So the basic idea is, as this cartoon here shows you, is we are going to be observing data the way we do, right? Experiments, we can measure the spatial position of an entity. We can measure the time elapsed between certain initial time point and the later observation. And then we're going to be estimating these unknown phases, and through some transformations where there are spectral transformations like the Fourier transform or Laplace transformations and others, we are going to be reconstructing the signal into this data science space. So in the experimental space, we don't have the phases. However, we can either estimate them or approximate them or use aggregators or other methods to derive these estimates. And then in the data analytics space, our data would become intrinsically anchored in this 5-dimensional space. So this is, by the way, very similar to what crystallographers have done for decades by observing just the magnitudes of their projections of the diffraction patterns, and then reconstructing the object crystal model in 3D. So here is an example of an fMRI of what we are really looking at. So I'm going to take functional magnetic resonance imaging, an fMRI, but I'm just going to take a two-dimensional slice through it, and I'm going to monitor this slice across time. So once you have this three-dimensional volume, right, this axis here is the temporal axis, and then the orthogonal two-dimensional projection is just one cross-section of the brain. And then we are just going to plot the isosurface that corresponds to this. So if you ignore the reconstruction of the fMRI signal by setting the phases to be trivial, you're going to be getting an isosurface that looks like this. Whereas if you use actually the correct phase estimates for these unknown quantities or time directions, you're going to be getting a lot more detailed and fine structure that obviously one can expect to lead more informative inference at the end. So, so here is an example of what happens in practice for these longitudinal processes that we all study. They go from being a single time series into what we call time surfaces. So every process, like somebody's heart rate, or respiration rate, or anything like this, that's an oscillatory process, will become not really an oscillatory surface, but it's going to become a surface that has ups and downs, and it's got certain curvature, it's got some obviously local and global extrema, and so forth, that we can obviously monitor and study analytically much better than looking at cross sections or projections of this time surface with individual fixed phases that kind of lead to these time series that we have been analyzing for a while. So here is just two what's called foliation projections. The green, the red and the blue curve here indicate two different phase approximations that kind of give you a unique time series, but then the surface obviously carries a lot more information that we need to use in the subsequent analysis. So to come back to the fMRI example, so here is a cross-section of a real fMRI scan. The crosshairs show you a specific voxel location that we're going to pick, and we're going to track it through time, right? That's what we're going to be doing. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to take this time series and we are going to cut it into two, because in this specific example, there is a rest condition and a stimulus condition. So we're going to call this a difference between on and off states, stimulation states that the subject is going under. And we're going to construct this difference time surface. And that's what it looks like really in reality, the difference of the time surface. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this time surface to do predictive forward-looking forecasting of the expected time course of this analysis. Okay, so if you'd like to see more demos about that, you can look at the predictive.space website for the time complexity and inferential uncertainty, or just go to spacekime.org. We are also building an R package that supports all of this theoretical development that can be employed not only for fMRI, but for any longitudinal process that we're studying. And I'd like to acknowledge funding that we have from both the National Institutes of Health as well as the National Science Foundation. And as other colleagues mentioned earlier, the secret sauce is teamwork. Here's the Soccer Lab and some of my colleagues that have significantly contributed to that research. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ivo. Fascinating. Let's see. I think just for the sake of time, since we lost a little bit there, we will move on, but we will keep the questions for the networking session.